Good morning, friends. It's Sunday, August the 2nd, and this is a rebroadcast of Happy Half Hour from last night. We're so sorry about the technology issues, and we're doing a backup taping in case we freeze up again today. I am very pleased to bring you Season 2 of Happy Half Hour Sip Trips. And now I turn it over to Al and Cheryl Kellert at Gray Ghost Vineyards.
Are we on now?
Yes, we're on.
Hey, it's wonderful to have you all back with us. So sorry about the little mess up yesterday, but I think we're going to still have a good time and have a chance to give some valuable information on what's really going on in the vineyard. We're starting Season 2 of the Gray Ghost Happy Half Hour, which we're dubbing Sip Trips. And the reason we're doing this is we're taking ourselves out of the studio and right into the field. So you're going to actually have what you might call hands-on experience of what's happening in the vineyard, what's going on in the winery at various locations during the course of this season, and also have a little bit of a discussion on some of the events that we also sponsor and why we sponsor them and what they're all about. But of course, before we start, I'm still going to go with the same little joke that we had at the very beginning with the young lady whose child swallowed a coin and got stuck in her throat. Of course, she immediately panicked and went running out calling for help. A gentleman who happened to be walking by said, "Let me see if I can help." And he put his lips across the lips of the little boy, sucked real hard, pulled the coin out of the throat, and saved the little boy's life. The mother, of course, was beside herself and said, "Doctor, that was the most wonderful thing I've ever seen. Did you learn that in medical school?" He replied, "Actually, I'm not a doctor. I work for the IRS."
Bada bing.
So, with that, I think before we start the program, it's really important that we talk a little bit about the wine. But also, I wanted Cheryl to fill you in a little bit of some of the exciting things that happened to her. Now, you'll probably note that due to the time, we're not actually with glasses of wine. However, Cheryl does have the bottle that we're featuring today, and that's our romantic rosé. Cheryl, anything exciting happening this week? That's fine. Thank you very much for your input. Really appreciated that. Now, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the featured wine today. This is the romantic rosé. It's the first time we've produced a rosé, and it was actually something that occurred as we were in the process of developing for the past 2 years. It's a classic rosé using 3 of the 5 Bordeaux varietals which we grow here on the property. These are proprietary and confidential blends, and therefore we do not share them with you. I'm sorry about that. The 3 are lightly macerated prior to pressing, cold fermented, and then prior to bottling, they're racked and run through a very tight filter, giving us a very sparkling wine. We recommend the rosé to actually be consumed as cold, and some of the foods that they pair very well with include seafood, shellfish, salads, fruits, cheeses, and the lighter pasta dishes. Now, Cheryl and I, a couple of days ago, had the rosé with crab cakes, and they were just incredible. Really a great match. So if you have a chance, do take advantage of that mix. Now, what's the agenda for today? Well, today what we're going to be doing is talking a little bit about the vineyard and what's actually transpiring in the vineyard, and also take a look at a vine. So you'll have a chance to see the various parts of the vine that we're working with during the course of a year. What I have behind me is a vine that has actually had half of the vine die and the other half being surviving. If you note, we're going to talk about the different parts. There is the trunk, the cordon, the spurs that are actually pruned down to the individual spur, which we can generate next year for fruit. And then, of course, when you get to the live segment of the vine, we have the shoots. These are the green items on the shoot. And what I'm going to do is get a pointer here. I'm running out of space. So the shoots, the leaves, of course you'll note the fruit. Amy, can you pick that up over there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then the shoots, while they're growing, are called shoots. Once they start to harden off and turn the brownish color you see here, they're called canes. And this is what we end up pruning off. Each cane will generate 1 to 2 clusters. I'm sorry, each shoot will generate 1 to 2 clusters. When a cluster is forming, it actually forms as an imperfect cluster of flowers. And as a result, what you're going to get is the cluster itself. Now, one thing you don't see is the root system. When you're growing vineyards in a vine, it normally takes about 3 to 5 years for a vine to develop enough before you can start taking fruit. As a result, we pull all the fruit off of a young vine and allow all the energy to go into the vine to create a stronger plant in order to support the fruit down the road. Now, another thing that we don't see on these particular vines, since this is Vidal, is the graft union. All vinifera vines, all European vines, have to be grafted on American rootstock. The European rootstock is susceptible to a little insect called phylloxera. And there's 2 types of phylloxeras. There's a root-boring phylloxera and also an airborne phylloxera. The airborne phylloxera attacks the leaves but really causes no damage. The root-boring phylloxera is the one that actually girdles the roots and ultimately kills the vine. So that's why we have to use American rootstock, because it's not susceptible to that. Once the plant has reached its maturity, we then can start taking a crop. Now, in the particular vine we're looking at right now, you'll note that half of the vine is green, half of the vine has died. What we've done on this particular vine is created a replacement shoot. And you can actually see it growing up on the side. The replacement shoot will ultimately replace the dead segment of the vine when during the winter pruning season, when that's laid back down, thus giving us a whole vine that will actually produce. So, now that we've had a chance to take a look at the vine, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the growing season. And I'm going to get myself out of the sun here. At this point in time, I wish I had a nice cold glass of romantic rosé. However, since I don't, I'll just keep talking and talking fast. What we're going to do is go through a regular year that Cheryl and I actually go through during the course of the growing season. And it'll give you some indication of what's happening in the vineyard, what's happening to the vine, and what has to be done to manage this vineyard so it does produce high quality fruit. What we're going to do is start in late November, early December, when we begin what we call winter pruning. That's when everything you see behind me, the leaves are now gone, the canes have now developed and hardened off, and all of this is going to be cut off, leaving us nothing more than what you see on the dead segment of the vine, which is going to be spurs. All of this takes place between late November and March. In March and going into April is when the trellis repair and vineyard repair actually takes place. Once the pruning is done, what we do is go back and take a look at any wires that have broken, any posts that are broken. All of this is replaced. At the same time, the cordons that you see behind me are now reattached to the cordon wire to make sure that they're in a stable position during the growing season. By April, we're now looking at bud break. And this is probably very critical. Well, it is very critical because now we face the potential of frost. And again, I think many of you remember that this was a rough year for our Chardonnay. When bud break begins, that's the beginning of the growing season. And the vines basically start to grow as shoots until around May, when the bloom begins to take effect. Each cluster, each berry represents a single flower. The flowers are imperfect. They do not have petals. And a vine is self-pollinating, so we don't need bees. During the course of bloom, there is nothing more incredible than the aroma of the vineyard. The flowers are just spectacular. Once bloom is completed, now the fruit begins to develop. And from June to August, the berries are beginning to grow, and at the same time, so is the vine. So now we begin the management of the vineyard. We're very, very fortunate this year to have a great college crew and high school crew of young girls who are helping us in the vineyard and have made this just one of the most spectacular years we've ever had. Canopy management includes hedging, removing of any laterals and leaves that are covering up the fruit, and therefore we try to expose as much as possible the fruit to the sunlight so that the fruit has a chance to develop very richly and a lot of sugars to it. We've now made it through August, and now we're facing harvest. Many of you out there have participated in our volunteer harvest program, so you're very familiar with this. Harvest starts normally late August, early September, and depending on what we're picking, could go as late as October. If we're doing a dessert wine, we've actually picked as late as November and into December. All the grapes are hand-picked, and this gets us the ability to make sure that the fruit is in solid shape, in good positions, etc. By late October, we're now pretty well completed, and now November rolls around. We do everything in our power to keep the leaves on the vine as long as possible, because we want those leaves to generate enough energy so the vine can develop carbohydrates and protect itself throughout the winter. Of course, during November, the leaves begin to fall off, and now what's happening? We're starting all over again. So this is basically what transpires in a vineyard and what has to be done in order to manage that vineyard during the course of a year. However, that's not the only thing that's going on. The grapevines are also suffering from a lot of different pests, diseases, insects, and of course little critters. To begin with, the spraying schedule really starts in April and pretty much is over early August. We basically spray for 4 types of diseases. The first one occurs in spring, which is phomopsis. Phomopsis is a disease that causes little lacerations on the shoots, causing it to ultimately transfer to the stems of the cluster and can very easily kill the cluster, kill the grapes. So we have to maintain a tight spray schedule early in the season in order to guarantee that the phomopsis doesn't generate a problem for us down the road. In late spring, early summer is when the second disease begins to show up, and that's black rot. It's a very innocuous looking little problem. If you were to look at a leaf that has black rot, it's just a little brown spot, but it's devastating to the fruit. If it gets onto the cluster, it basically mummifies the grapes, causing them to become hard, black, little raisin-like items which have no juice, nothing. Effectively, they're mumminized and they just fall off, so you lose your crop. So once again, this is something we're spraying for. One thing that occurs throughout the growing season for us is, and this happens just everywhere, depending on where you're, doesn't make any difference whether you're in California, Europe, or right here in Virginia, and that's powdery mildew. Powdery mildew normally occurs in when humidity is high and the temperatures range somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to about 90 degrees. If it takes off, it can get on the individual grapes, causing the skins to freeze so they can't expand. Therefore, as the berry begins to grow, basically they split and the berry is destroyed, causing the fruit basically to rot. The one upside of powdery mildew is it only affects the fruit while it's growing until it reaches to about 4 to 6% residual sugar, or bricks. Once it hits that level, they're resistant to powdery mildew, and that's why we're able to cut down on our spray schedule in that regard. However, that doesn't solve the problem. We have one last disease that now is affecting the vineyard late in the summer and going into fall, and it's called downy mildew. Downy mildew is a disease that affects normally the young shoots, the young leaves on the top of the plant, but then can spread down through the rest of the plant. Of course, we need those leaves in order to develop the fruit. The frightening part about downy mildew is if you don't control it, it has the ability to defoliate a vineyard in a span of about a week or two, which eliminates, of course, the ability for that vine now to produce fruit. So that takes us through disease problems, but now let's take a look at the insect problems we face. Of course, I think everybody here in Virginia is familiar with Japanese beetles. I look at that as hitting us sometime around July 4th. The Japanese beetle has a 10-day life cycle. If you can hit it early, you only need to put on one spray. It eliminates the economic damage of the beetle, and you've eliminated the population. If you miss that window, then you're really talking about 3 sprays, about every 10 days, in order to knock that population down. Another problem that we have is what's called the grapeberry moth. It's a little moth that lays a single egg in a berry. That berry then has a larva that's eating the inside of the grape and actually later on pops out and then becomes a full-grown moth, mating and relaying eggs again. Early in the season, if a berry is affected, it really doesn't impact the cluster. Late in the season, when the fruit is ripening, if that berry breaks, the juice will run out, ultimately going into sour rot or sour botrytis, and the result is the loss of the fruit. So that's one we have to be very careful with. As a vineyard ages, we have what's called the grape-root borer, and of course, Cheryl in our vineyard is well over 33 years old, so we do have this problem. The grape-root borer is an insect that spends 2 years of its lifetime underground chewing away at the root system of a vine. It then surfaces for a period of a week or two to mate, lay her eggs. Basically, she dies and the next cycle starts. We have been very fortunate to work with Virginia Tech's entomology department in looking at possible ways of developing pheromones which impact the ability of their mating, actually interrupt their mating schedule, and possibly reducing the population of the grape-root borer. Is that it? Nope. There's one other item that's also rather unique, and that's the European red mite. A vine that has the European red mite has a tendency to develop bronzing on the leaf. If you see that and touch the leaf and look at your hand, you're going to see little red spots on the hand. That's an indication that the European red mite is in the vineyards. This has to be controlled vigorously because once the leaf starts to brown, it loses its ability to develop carbohydrates and ripen the fruit. A couple of other items that are what you might call invasive species. Of course, we're all familiar with the marmalata stink bug. And although it is a pest, it has not impacted our vineyard or vineyards per se. The aromas from the stink bug do dissipate, so if it gets into the wine during the processing, it doesn't impact the wine at all. The lantern fly, another invasive species, is moving from Pennsylvania and heading south. Right now, it has not impacted Virginia, at least not in our part of Virginia, so we're kind of hoping we can avoid that issue. So, have we solved all the problems? Not quite. Now we start going for the big boys, and those are the animal pests that we face on a regular basis. That's deer, bear, birds, raccoons, turkeys, Canada geese, and squirrels, all of which have impacted us in some degree one way or another. Cheryl and I do eat a lot of venison, so that should give you an indication of how we've solved a portion of that problem. Bear is another issue. Even though we do put up wire netting that allows us to protect the vineyards from the deer, the bear have a way of just breaking right through it. And a bear will not go from vine to vine munching individual clusters. Basically, they sit in front of a vine, pulling it down and destroying the vine while they consume the entire crop. So that's an issue. We've only had 2 times when we've had bird problems. Both were when we had the 17-year cicada or locust coming through. The birds did swoop down on us then. One problem we have had recently, which we're still trying to get under control, are raccoons. Raccoons will come right through the netting and just decimate the vineyard. We're doing a lot of trapping now to see if we can reduce the population of them. Another thing for all of you hunters out there is turkeys. We do have a nice crop of turkeys that come in, and nothing kills you more than to see the turkey stretching their neck and nibbling on the base of a vine. Canada geese, they're no longer migratory birds. We have our own little populations of them right here that nest on the vineyard. And then of course you got the little guys, the squirrels. Canada geese, we just try to shoo away the squirrels. We're doing similar to what we're doing with the raccoons, and that's trying to trap them. Well, this kind of gives you a synopsis of what's happening in the life of a vineyard and what's happening in the life of Cheryl and me. So if for any of you that are really anxious to start a vineyard, I think we've got an ideal opportunity for you right here. Now, one last quick story before we start to close out, and I think it's kind of in a way kind of humorous. Back in the early 80s, when Al was 5 and Amy was only 7, I was sent out to the West Coast to head up the Postal Service's regional marketing office in their sales department. It was headquartered in San Bruno, just south of San Francisco. At that time, Napa Valley was very similar in nature to what you see here in Virginia. And Cheryl and I spent a lot of time going up there and visiting, and when we did, we would buy a loaf of sourdough bread, get some great Italian sausage, and then sit down with some cheese, fruit, let the kids run around in the vineyard while we sat on a blanket and enjoyed ourselves with a great bottle of wine. We couldn't help but notice that the vineyards were immaculate and nobody ever seemed to be working in them. So we thought, hey, we can do this. Well, you're looking at 2 people who are now well past the past point of being intelligent, still doing it after 30-some years, but we're having a good time. Since this is being videotaped, I know we're not going to have the opportunity to get questions. What I would encourage you to do, if you have any, you email them or send a text to Amy, and what we're going to try to do is figure out why we're having a problem on a live feed and try to get as many questions answered as we possibly can. As a closing, of course, it's always kind of fun to end with a note of humor. And so what I'm going to do is pass on one little story to you about our president, who was at the time looking to find out who the best law enforcement agency was in the country. And he selected 3 agencies to examine. One was the CIA, one was the FBI, and then the LAPD. He had a rabbit put into the woods and told each of the agencies to go in and find the rabbit. The CIA went in first, and after spending months of interrogating forest dwellers and running forensic tests, they basically came to the conclusion that the rabbit really never existed. Next went in the FBI. They burned down half the forest, claiming that the rabbit had provoked them, which was their excuse. Finally, the LAPD went in, and less than a half an hour later, came out dragging a badly beaten bear who was yelling at the top of its voice, "Okay, okay, I'm a rabbit, I'm a rabbit." With that, thank you all so much for being patient with us. We love you all and love for all that you've done.
Tune in next week as we enjoy the 2019 Cabernet Franc. This has been another episode of the Happy Half Hour, but this time Season 2 Sip Trips with Al and Cheryl. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.